Welcome to this very special World Bank event on the front lines of rising fragility. I'm Kathleen Hays. I'm the Bloomberg Television and Radio Global Economics and Policy Editor, and I am going to be your moderator today. You know, we're meeting here in Washington, D.C., spring meetings of the World Bank and International Monetary Fund, unfortunately, under the shadow of war. In the last few months, threats to stability in Asia, Latin America, Africa, and now with the war in Ukraine, Europe joins that list. It's becoming crystal clear, no country will be untouched by the ripple effects of the war in Ukraine. So what can we do to help? Today, we're going to hear from experts, change makers, people on the front lines. We're going to learn how the international community can come together to help the most vulnerable people. And a reminder, we're streaming this event in English, French, Spanish, and Arabic at live.worldbank.org. We want to reach as many people as possible. Let's start with a look at what's coming up over the next hour. So as I watch those pictures roll by, I'm getting very excited. We're going to have some really interesting conversations ahead. Before, however, we're going to dive into our first discussion. We're going to hear now from David Malpass, president of the World Bank Group.
Thank you for joining us today. This year's spring meetings are taking place at a very difficult time. I've been deeply shocked and horrified at the war in Ukraine. It has already led 4.6 million Ukrainians to flee their country, while an additional 7 million are internally displaced. The war comes at a time when the economic recovery from COVID-19 had already begun to falter. The ongoing war will further erode short-term economic prospects. Countries in Europe and Central Asia will be directly affected through refugee inflows, trade, and remittances, as well as increased uncertainty and risk aversion. Globally, countries will suffer from spikes in food and energy prices. The poorest and most vulnerable countries will be hit the hardest. In response to these challenges, we will be discussing options with our board for a 15-month crisis response envelope of around $170 billion to cover April 2022 through June 2023. This extraordinary surge of support is being designed to help developing countries address the setbacks caused by overlapping crises, impacts of the war, food and fuel price shocks, disruptions to trade, supply chains, and investment, as well as the ongoing threats from pandemic, climate change, and unsustainable debt. The war in Ukraine comes at a time when fragility, violent conflict, and social unrest have increased dramatically. We estimate that 39 of our 189 member countries are experiencing open conflict situations or remain worryingly fragile. Conflicts are triggering the rapid displacement of millions of people. By the end of 2020, the number of people who were forcibly displaced reached a record high of 82 million, and it keeps growing. This reflects major displacement crises in the Sahel and the Horn of Africa and in countries around the globe: Afghanistan, Haiti, Myanmar, Syria, Yemen, to name just a few. Conflicts are further fostered by the flow of weapons. We need to stop the flow of weapons into fragile and conflict-affected situations and help reduce the stockpiles of firearms and landmines that remain from previous outbreaks of violence. Working on the front lines of rising fragility requires dedicated financing, international collaboration, and sound analytical work, and private sector involvement. And yet, the success is not guaranteed. First, there's financing. Our financial support to fragile and conflict-affected countries increased fourfold from $3.9 billion in 2015 to $15.8 billion in 2020. We have also increased our financing to tackle forced displacement. During IDA 18 and IDA 19, we made a combined total of $3.4 billion of dedicated funding available under the Window for Host Communities and Refugees. And we have a further allocation of $2.4 billion planned under IDA 20. We have also shown that we can act swiftly. IDA participants have just endorsed $1 billion to Ukraine and $100 million to Moldova from IDA 19. The Afghanistan Reconstruction Trust Fund, ARTF, which the bank administers, provided $280 million to UNICEF and the World Food Program for humanitarian support. Second, international coordination and analytical work are vital. We must work in concert with diplomatic security and humanitarian actors in increasingly complex and protracted crises. Sustainable peace requires engagement on all fronts by development partners in line with their comparative advantages. The launch of our FCV strategy 2 years ago underscored a change in how we approach these situations and provides a strong foundation for our long-term engagement before, during, and after situations of conflict and fragility. We have strengthened our analytics, become more flexible in our operations, and invested heavily in institutions and infrastructure in the most fragile environments. Finally, it's important to involve the private sector early on. Even in the most difficult of situations, private sector provides jobs and services and keeps markets moving. In many cases, it's the primary bulwark against acute vulnerability and deprivation. For example, in Jordan, we have supported private sector jobs and financial inclusion of refugees. In the Sahel, IFC is investing to increase financial and insurance services for small enterprises owned or led by women. As development actors, we must not wait for the conflict to end before we engage and start rebuilding. Today, we will hear from leading world figures on key aspects of the rising conflict and fragility and what we must do to address these challenges. I want to thank you. I wish you all a good discussion, and I look forward to hearing your ideas.
Hola, I'm Samir in Suva, Fiji, and you're watching the World Bank Group and IMF Spring Meetings.
And let me also say thank you, David, for laying out the challenges and how the international community can be part of the solutions. As for you, you can share your thoughts on those remarks and the conversations to come using the hashtag #RisingFragility. You can follow us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, anyone, all of them. You can also post comments and questions at live.worldbank.org. And believe me, we're going to be watching those very closely. That's where we have experts standing by to answer your questions in English, Spanish, French, and Arabic. You can see they're hard at work, doing their job. We're just very excited they're there. And again, very excited that you're going to be in touch with us. And by the way, we're going to put some of the most popular questions to two bank experts live at the end of today's event. First, though, to really understand the scale of the challenge, let's look at some of the facts. At Bloomberg, we talk about looking at the numbers, looking at data, and so does the World Bank. Let me show you this chart. Okay. It's where the world's extreme poor live. The orange bar on the left represents the number located in fragile and conflict-affected situations, FCS. Now, take a look at the right-hand bar. It's much bigger. It's the number not living in those challenging settings. At least that was the situation in the year 2000. 4 out of 5 of the world's extreme poor lived in economies not suffering from fragility or conflict. Now we'll show you what has happened as the century has progressed. The proportion of poor people living in those non-fragile countries, you can see it falling at quite a fast rate. That's because poverty in these economies was massively declining, a very good trend. Now, today, it's estimated that more than half the world's poor, however, still reside in economies that are suffering from fragility and conflict. Improvement, but not really perfect yet. So now let's take a look at the projections, too. By 2030, it's thought nearly 2/3 of the world's poor will be living in these challenging situations. And this is an important finding as well. You can see now, I hope, how important it is eliminating extreme poverty. It requires an urgent focus on these very fragile contexts, which are still so many in the world, and in some cases, there and getting worse. Now, earlier, I had the great pleasure of speaking to His Excellency Yameen Abdulmalik Saeed, Prime Minister of Yemen. I started by asking the Prime Minister about the developmental challenges repeated crises have presented and the key steps the government has taken to address them. Your Excellency, Yemen has been living through a prolonged series of crises: conflict, the pandemic, climate events. These all present big developmental challenges. What are the key actions the government's been taking to address these challenges?
Thank you, Kathleen. Like you mentioned, Yemen facing a complicated, severe crisis, and now accumulated during the 7 years of war. Humanitarian crisis, we have deteriorating in economy. UNDP estimated that the Yemen economy set back 2 decades, and if it go back maybe to 4 decades if it continue. We lost $126 billion in total in GDP during the 6 years of war. We have 4 million IDPs, internally displaced people. We have 20 million food insecure in Yemen. So all that accumulated, and also the COVID-19 that we faced in 2020, the main concern for the government is to preserve the economy. We don't want the people to lose the purchasing power. We need to control the deterioration of the currency, and so surging the inflation. This is the main concerns that we during the last years. And we took some actions, reforms in the central bank. We control the budget deficit. We bring it back to 30% comparing to in 2021, comparing to 54% in 2020. Revenues, we raised it from oil sector and non-oil sector. It raised 47% during 2021 comparing to 2020. This is one of the main things that we want to control, and we inject money to the health sector so we can face COVID-19 pandemic. We built around 26 isolation camps around the country, 14 oxygen factory. We face a lot of difficulties providing oxygen to the isolation camp. We built that in 2020 and 2021, and enhanced the capacity of the health sector, and run vaccination campaigns. All that with the support of international community.
So let's talk more about the role the international community has played. What steps have been most important? Where could this assistance, this cooperation improve?
It's important, and one of the key issues is stay engaging. Engaging in those crises, because sometimes it's closed doors cause a lot of problems. The cost of disengaging is high. IDA, for example, is an example of global solidarity. The amount that they support countries like Yemen helps in our situation. So for the international community, it's important to stay engaging, and also mitigating risk rather than avoiding risks is important. That's why one of the examples, the World Bank interventions during the crisis is I think they have example in Yemen, and we work together, and we enhance that. And also presence on the ground. If the donors knows more about political atmosphere and economic atmosphere inside the country, they can design good ways in implementation and helping the country. And also balancing between emergency response and long-term development. It's always emergency response, but we need to balance that. We need to capitalize more in sustainable and inclusive growth. That's important. This is one of the main issues that I can recall.
You know, the world is watching the war in Ukraine. We know there are several countries around the world that are in crisis. What lessons can they learn from Yemen, from the steps you have taken, how you've gotten through this?
We are in major problems in food insecurity. We started, I mentioned at the beginning, we have 20 million Yemeni insecure and food insecure. And the war in Ukraine shows how fragility we could end up by the end of this year. And not only Yemen, other countries facing crisis maybe face that. We have 31% of our wheat come from Ukraine. At the beginning of this year, when we set up with the traders, we sit with them and we try to find different sources of that. That's why by the wheat prices raise 7 times between 2015 until now. In a country like Yemen with the loose purchasing power, that affects a big sector of people. That's why we think about all this situation. We are facing a devastating situation by the end of this year. So if we I think seizing a window of hope is important. Now in Yemen, we have the truce. In countries like facing crisis, seizing the opportunities for bringing peace is important and giving hope to the people. And also there is a different elements like supporting private sector. In country like Yemen, there is a places more secure and people can create jobs. That's why we support the private sector always, that they can work and we can rely on the private sector to help us. And also, aligned with that is investing in human capital. And the issue also is important to scaling support to the countries like Yemen. Unprecedented times need unprecedented actions. It's not the response for the crisis, not the crisis itself. The response of the crisis determine how we can build back better after the crisis. So the response should be unique, responding to the crisis itself. So it's one of the lessons learned from the Ukraine-Russian war that affect the whole world, not only Yemen, but we are talking about fragility and fragile countries facing crisis. And as we talked in the beginning, we have multiple layers of crisis aligned with COVID-19 and natural disasters. And we face that as a government in different governorates in a different crisis we find.
Your Excellency, thank you very much for an illuminating and inspiring conversation.
Thank you, Catherine.
Ngaramutse, I'm Sandrine Ninahadre in Bujumbura, Burundi, and we're watching the World Bank Group IMF Spring Meetings.
Now we're going to look at how to actually support fragile communities, how to provide immediate aid during conflict and not lose focus on long-term resilience. Our guests today are all leaders in the humanitarian development peace nexus. Hervé Ndoba is Minister of Finance for the Central African Republic. Svenja Schultz is Federal Minister for Economic Cooperation and Development in Germany. Axel von Trotzenberg is the Managing Director of Operations here at the World Bank, and Catherine Russell is Executive Director for UNICEF. I welcome you all. It's a busy week, and I'm glad you could take time. Hervé, let me start with you, because Central African Republic has been going through this transition from a long period, rocky period of instability, lasting recovery. That's quite an accomplishment. So how did that occur? How did you make that happen? And how has the World Bank supported your efforts?
Thank you very much for this question and for the opportunity to give in to talk about Central African Republic, my country, which is known for the last 3 decades to live in a period of social crisis. We actually have been able to establish security into the country, and we are working very hard to try to settle the different ways in order to change the cycle of fragility, conflict, and violence in the country, just by having some measures that we have started to set into the country. Those measures are some of them political measures and some of them financial measures. For the political measures, for example, we've started to establish some tools into the country. For example, the DDRR, which is demobilization, disarmament, reintegration, and reinsertions of people who used to be into the war, okay, so that we can integrate them back into the society. We also have setting up another tool, which is a APPR, which is a political agreement, yes, with all the stakeholders of those conflicts. Because just for your mind, we at the high take of the crisis, we count 17 army groups into the country, but we've been able to manage all those army groups into those different tools, and we are actually moving forward through the Republican dialogue, which is very important in order to understand what is going on in this country and why we are facing those cycles of war for those 3 decades. So having said that, we are also doing important things on the financial parts, because of course when we are facing fragility, the fiscal space is very reduced, right, and we have to find solutions in order to increase this fiscal space so that the government can ensure the expenses which he has to ensure. And then we have started cleanup of the public financing. This is very important, and I'm very pleased to have the World Bank on the table, because we have 2 projects which are very important for us, regarding digitalization, for example, and we are working on those subjects in order to move forward.
It's interesting though how you show us that there's so many different elements, that they all come together to help create this moving forward and the stability. Svenja, for Germany, exciting year in many ways, but you're hosting the G7 presidency this year. Germany, the largest, richest country in Europe. You play a very important role in so many of these big questions now. Fragility hotspots. You've already stepped up and done a lot for Ukraine and surrounding countries. But broadly speaking, who's on your radar screen, and how do you target responses to countries and situations that are so very different?
For us, it is very important to see that we have overlapping crises. We have the crisis because of the pandemic. We still not win the fight against the pandemic. We see the climate crisis. We see the loss of biodiversity. And then now the war against Ukraine and all the consequences we see in the world. So having that all together, that need really coordinated answers, and someone need to coordinate these answers. So we see that G7 has to take a leading role, and that the World Bank need to have a leading role. Just an example for food security. We see a lot of action now, but the coordination and leadership in this action to say, okay, we share on our analysis, we just discuss who is responsible for what. This coordination, that is what we like to bring forward, where we are very happy that the World Bank is able to coordinate that we can help to deal with that. And I think that is really important. We need to change the agricultural system. We need to adapt on what climate change is bringing with us. And we need short-term action and long-term engagement. And to bring that together, that is the challenge we have.
I think a lot of people aren't in government always understand how important all that coordination is, communication, et cetera. So, Catherine, hundreds of millions of children have had their educations not just disrupted, but maybe permanently damaged, thrown off track. around the world. And it seems also in some of the poorest countries, they're going to have the hardest time catching up because they don't have the richness of resources. How is UNICEF, how are you going to use all the partnerships you have with so many countries, so many other agencies to work on this?
Well, I think, first of all, you're 100% right that even before COVID, we had a global humanitarian and learning crisis in this country, in this world, right? We had 260 million kids who weren't in school. This is pre-COVID, right? We had 50% of 10-year-olds in low and middle income countries couldn't understand a simple sentence, read and understand a simple sentence. So now we have COVID on top of that. We've had school closures. We have 23 countries still where schools are not fully back on track. These children have been out of classes for so long. They've lost so much learning. Our estimate now is that it's close to 70% of children in some of these countries at age 10 don't have very basic skills. So you're right, UNICEF is very focused on this, very committed to this, but we cannot do this alone. We need partnerships. And one really good example of that is the work we've been doing in Yemen, where we work with several people. Save the Children is doing teacher training. The World Bank has thankfully come and done financing for us. UNICEF is doing a lot of work building and refurbishing schools and also providing a lot of the basics for children to learn. And then the World Food Program is there providing food, right? So everybody comes together, but to Svenja's point, you have to have the coordination efforts, and the bank is critical with that. I mean, we work very closely with the bank in many places. We know how to do that, but it's not easy to coordinate in these places. But we now have 1,000 schools that are open and operating in Yemen, where it's a dreadful situation overall, and so many children are still out of school and hungry and lots of problems. But you can show that we can make progress even in the most difficult circumstances.
When you say that 1,000 schools opening, I just almost get goosebumps. It's really very, very exciting. Axel, I want to ask you about the fragility, conflict, and violence strategy of the World Bank. I mean, officially in place, a real focus in the last couple of years. Obviously, it's something the World Bank has been involved in for decades. In this what we kind of call the FCV focus and strategy, what have you learned? What would you say the main focus is now?
Well, you just heard it. I always concentrate is where is the extreme poverty, and increasingly in the FCV, the extreme poverty is concentrated. And what we have had for decades, far too long, was a paradigm of pillars. Here you have humanitarian, you have develop, here you have security. So now we talk about the nexus, and here is basically what it is. Nobody can do this alone. You have to work together and to see how we can complement each other's strengths. And this is badly needed, not only for actually having results on the ground, but actually that the situations are difficult. Take in Afghanistan, when you cannot really deal with the Taliban, but at the same time people are suffering. How can you still there? There, the UN is a great organization, UNICEF, but WFP. But there are many other interventions that you have to do, and that means that you have to coordinate that smartly with bilateral, with multilateral, and I think that is where we need what I'm learning is actually most what I've learned now with Afghanistan since August last year is we have an Afghanistan Reconstruction Trust Fund where donors are coordinated and where we are actually discussing the hard questions, not to find an excuse not to do it, but to do it. And I think we have been able to make progress because you need also to find a consensus on this. Ultimately, what is from an operational perspective is about a third of the IDA resources are going to FCV countries, and it's also the right thing to do. But we have also to realize that the last year has been a total disaster. What FCV countries, it started with coup d'etats in Myanmar. You saw Afghanistan, Yemen, Horn of Africa, Sahel, and not to forget Haiti. So we have a lot of countries where we need to have this, but the most important thing is we need to stay engaged. We cannot walk away just because it is difficult.
Yeah, well, let's move to the question for everybody, a little bit more of a lightning round here, because now you have a better sense, all the shocks, all you're dealing with, and I think you put that more specific steps, individuals, real people into this. And the last couple of years have been especially bad. Who knew that the pandemic would also have these terrible climate big fire all over the world, et cetera, and of course now war in more places, in Ukraine. So with that in mind, looking ahead, what should be on our radar screens? What's the first one or two things that you're going to be looking at that you want the people who are listening to think about?
Well, I think for me, one thing which is very important is the coordination. We heard about it already. UNICEF talked about our coordination, the World Bank also. It is very important because in our country, for example, we realized that after having made some work together with all the partners, then we realized that sometimes there's a lot of money which are put on only one topics or two topics, and the others are not covered. So we have to prioritize, okay, what we want to do with this money, which comes from the partners. Okay, so this is the first point. The second point is just that we learn from this global situation in the world that the countries which are facing fragility are in a situation where they should invest in their infrastructure in order to be prepared to face those kind of shocks, because for us with the pandemic of COVID, this was the last shock that we are supposed to have, and now we have a new shock with the crisis in Ukraine. So we have to be prepared for this, and to be prepared for this, we have to invest into our infrastructure in order to be prepared, particularly in the fragility countries.
Axel, how do you answer that question?
Well, I would say we need political support. Therefore, a G7 or G20 or this type of meetings are so essential. Secondly, we should actually discuss openly security arrangements. Very difficult in the Sahels. Third, you need to focus on delivering. And I think that is, so talk is nice, but at the end, we still also shall stay focused. Ukraine is going to take a lot of attention and should take a lot of attention. Also, the other FCV countries deserve a lot of attention. So we need to do the dual task. You know, there can be a hotspot that where we need now to focus on. We cannot forget on the other countries. And then particularly in the delivery and the coordination, it needs to be on the delivery. Like, for example, in the UN family, you have different agencies who are good at the delivery. I think UNICEF has an excellent track record. WFP, they're on and they're moving it. With those agencies, you can actually move a lot. And I think the final thing is we need to stay very, very focused on this, because our estimate shows that extreme poverty will be concentrated in the FCV in the next couple of years. So if we want to stop that trend, we have to invest.
Svenja?
I just can underline what Axel is saying. Kristalina Georgieva said this morning, we need to expect that unexpected. That means that we have to take care that our societies are more resilient. And for the fragile states, is that really a challenge to be more resilient, to prevent the next crisis? And that is where the world needs to help, and where we need this multilateral approach. Not every country by its own, but more in a multilateral way. And I think that is what we should stay in the center. We need real partnership, not only talking about partnership, but really doing it in a multilateral way, financing the things that are needed to prevent the next crisis.
Catherine?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would say roughly 425 million children right now are living in conflict zones. Right? That's more than ever before in UNICEF's history. So you have that, and you have a crisis with the climate, and you have a conflict, and you have COVID. So these children are living in places where the compounding of the efforts or the challenges requires a compounding of the responses, right? And we need to be smarter about how we try to deliver responses to these people. And I think it means being smarter about how we do education. It means building resilience into our sanitation and water programs, right? It means really doing our best to deliver the best for the people who are most in need, because those are the people who never, it's always the most fragile situations, the poorest children and the children who are out of school, and then they have conflict, and it's just one thing after another. And I think we have to try to respond to that in a multilateral and coordinated and multi-sectoral way. Otherwise, we're not going to make any progress.
Well, I want to thank you all for this, because you made us think about the real people who are affected, but it also makes us think about the real people who are involved, trying to do this, trying to make this all work. I think it really helps us connect with, obviously with your challenges, and with the best of hopes and intentions, you still can't necessarily deliver. And I think you really gave us a window on that today, and I appreciate it, and I'm sure everybody watching does as well. So if you've just joined us, let me tell you that I'm Kathleen Hays, and you're watching the Spring Meetings event at the World Bank on rising fragility. A reminder now, you can join the conversation on today's event at any time using the hashtag risingfragility. And we're inviting you to take part in a poll. We're asking you, what do you think should be the top priority for a country going through conflict and fragility? And you have 6 choices. So, A, social protection for the poor. How about B, addressing food insecurity seems becoming a bigger problem every day. C, inclusion of vulnerable groups like women, people with disabilities, internally displaced persons. D, survival of local businesses, supporting the private sector. E, peace talks, conflict resolution. And your last option, addressing domestic and interpersonal violence. I know it's hard to choose because they're all so important, but even so, pick one. Cast your vote right now at live.worldbank.org, and we'll bring you the results at the end of this event. Now we're going to hear from an inspiring voice, one of strength in the face of adversity. Victor Achin is the founder and executive director for the African Youth Initiative Network. Victor, who was a 2015 Nobel Peace Prize nominee, spent 20 years of his life in a camp for internally displaced persons. Today, his organization has helped tens of thousands impacted by war. What is it that kept him going? Let's hear from Victor himself.
Our world is in turmoil with conflicts and war and suffering around us. This is the story that I identify with after spending 21 years of my life growing up in the camp for the internally displaced persons in the northern part of my country, Uganda. I quickly learned that my next meal was not guaranteed. In fact, I spent over 7 years surviving on one meal a day. Whenever I was sick, finding medicine was an operation in itself. The challenges kept on coming. And I saw my friends, just like me, who had missed out on years of education without the right skills to find jobs and get back on their feet. Thankfully, despite the hardships, some of us found hope that fueled our resilience. For me, it inspired the entrepreneurship spirit. And today, I am so honored to be working with young people from across Africa as we empower the victims of war and work with these young people as leaders in promoting peace. I see young people struggling to put food on their plates. Farmers suffering from climate change. And worst, the recent COVID-19 pandemic, which has been so difficult on many communities. To me, war or civil strife is the last thing we need. I applaud the World Bank Group and the partners for working in the fragile and conflict-affected areas to spark the much-needed hope. Hope can come in so many forms, including solidarity from the host government and the local population, or even the vaccination program that keeps all of us safe. Hope is the most powerful glue that sticks humanity together.
Many thanks to you, Victor, for sharing your compelling story. It's very relevant to our next guest, who will examine the refugee crisis and how to respond effectively. Joining me now via video link is Raouf Mazou. He's Assistant High Commissioner for Refugees at UNHCR, shaking his head hello. And we have here in Washington, Ioan Gumene. He's State Secretary at the Ministry of Finance for the government of Moldova. And Alejandra Potero, she's the Director General in the Department of Planning for the government of Colombia. So I welcome you all here. It's a very busy week. We're very happy you could take out time for us. Ioan Gumene, I want to start with you because we have seen now well more than 4 million refugees leaving Ukraine, going to their neighboring countries. And your country, Moldova, has taken more refugees per capita than any other one. You have stepped up, you've opened your arms. Tell us what it's like dealing with this. What are you doing? What's working? How big of a challenge this has been?
Yeah, thank you first of all for the opportunity to share our experience. So indeed, 10% of those 4 millions enter Moldova, so for about 400,000. So out of these refugees, 100,000 remain in Moldova, which is actually 4% of population of Moldova, a huge number, as you say. 50% of those refugees are remaining in Moldova are children. The rest are women and elderly people. So. The first thing for the government was to react quickly. Actually, there was no room to strategize, to elaborate on policy. The priority was to move quickly to ensure that those people have shelter. So actually, the immediate challenges were to ensure that the huge flow of people are safely entering Moldova. So at the same time, securing the border of Moldova, acknowledging the risks and the threats. The second challenge was to ensure shelter, food essential for those people, for a huge amount of people. And the third, to ensure medical care for those people, especially taking into consideration COVID pandemic. And that a lot of people were elderly. So these were immediate challenges. So for this, what were the solution actually? The solution were not there, as you can guess, because nobody expected this to happen. So the solution was that the parliament mandated government to take immediate solution. So the government actually took daily decision how to manage this flow of people, how to ensure shelters, how to ensure food. It created a single center for refugees, which developed the mechanism, how to allocate money, reallocate money from other budget programs, how to create all kind of shelters, how to help those people. And these were, as I said, very quick decisions taken daily. So but at the same time, we have the war. We don't know when the war will stop. So 100,000 people will remain probably for a longer time in Moldova. So the challenges for this period is to integrate these people in the society, so to reduce the burden on social system.
Okay. Well, Raouf, I want to turn to you now. In the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, you deal with refugee crises all over the world. Tell us what you have seen working best to help the refugees and then support all the things that have to happen once they've landed in a new place.
No, thanks a lot, and I would like to also thank the bank for having invited us to participate in this event. The involvement of the bank in the past few years in the search for solution for refugees and other internally displaced persons has really been a game changer. And I'm also particularly pleased to be on this panel with Director General Potero and State Secretary Gumene, since I was fortunate to travel to Colombia last November and to Moldova earlier this month. And as you've heard from Secretary of State Gumene, both countries are models in the way they are receiving and including people forced to flee their home. To respond to your question, there are many lessons that we are learning from, unfortunately, the growing forced displacement crisis that we are seeing around the world. Earlier, we made reference to Venezuela, to Afghanistan, to Myanmar, to Yemen, the Sahel, Ethiopia, just to name a few, and many of these situations protracted. I would say that the key lesson is that purely humanitarian responses are insufficient and often inadequate. And what we need is the involvement of development actors from the outset of the crisis to ensure a long-term perspective. The inclusion of refugees in national services such as health, education, and their ability to be economic actors are the best and the most effective path towards self-reliance. And this is what I've seen in Colombia, where I'm sure we will hear later on. The government has regularized 1.7 million national, allowing them to work, allowing them to be part of, to have access to social services. And this is also what we're seeing happening now in Moldova.
Okay. Alejandro, let's turn to you now, because Colombia has become, for several years now, a critical refuge for Venezuelan migrants who are leaving because of insecurity, instability, violence. So how did this evolve? How did you do what you had to do? And can you have any suggestions, share your experience for what other countries can do in this position?
Thank you for your question, and thank you to the World Bank for this invitation and for being able to share this space with such interesting colleagues. Effectively, this has been, as the State Secretary was saying, we have about 4% of the population right now of Colombia is comprised of Venezuelan migrants. 6 million Venezuelans have left Venezuela. Of them, 5 are staying in Latin America, and it is estimated that around 2 million of them are in Colombia. We're a country of 50 million people, so about 4%. Of these 2 million people, half of them are undocumented. So they come, they cross the border without any documents, without anything. 97% of them are under 55. 40% are between 25 and 50, so working age, and the rest are young, youth. So you have to have a very focused mechanism on families who are coming, mostly looking for economic opportunities, and they're coming. People who are coming to work, and the children. What I think the key issue, and I think what has been recognized internationally, is the temporary protection statute that we emitted last year. It's a temporary protection statute for 10 years. Very few countries in the world have done a 10-year working permit, and it gives every single right except voting rights. So social rights, civil rights, economic rights. It's like being a Colombian citizen without the voting, but it has every single other opportunity. So it's very integral, and it's very long-term in its approach, because it's really going to allow these families to set up a life in Colombia. Now, this can't be done if we don't think about an articulation of all the other sectors in addition to migration, both on a national level or on a territorial level. Because if we're going to promise to give them all the services so that they can be part of the social system, that they can be part of the health system, that they can go to the schools, everything, you have to have a plan to integrate the migrants in all these sectors. And that's why setting up a center of government approach, it's an office in the presidency that makes sure that all the sectors are doing the plan at the same time, because this has been very short and very recent. So to give you an example, we have to make sure that the banks accept the temporary protection status to be able to open an account. You have to make sure that they're in the health service so that they can access the health program and so on. And that's why you need to have a national level approach that has to come hand in hand with the work with the local governments, and that would be the other recommendation.
Wow.
So I think that would be, in summary, what we need to do, like a big plan, a very inclusive fraternal plan, but that has the whole government working together, both on a national level and on a territorial level.
This is a great idea turned into actually all the nuts and bolts that you need to get it done. Very impressive, very exciting.
Thank you.
Back to you, Secretary Meni. Obviously, the international community is helping Moldova take in all these refugees, and I know you're very grateful. Still want to know, what more could they do? What could be done better? Because again, I'm seeing so clearly in this event today, there's lots of great ideas, but one of the biggest challenges is making the idea, the intention, even the money flow through to what it needs to do.
Yeah. Thank you, first of all, for this opportunity and for your support, for the support of donors community, first of all. First of all, I would like to say that the economy, the budget was hit by the crisis, by energy crisis last year. So the prices on energy increased by 360%. So it's a lot. So the pressure on the budget was there. Then the refugee crisis came. The government did it quickly, so didn't expect some additional support for donors. So just relocating the money from one development program to refugees. We had a great support. So it's a example how donors community communicated, coordinated themselves. So the World Bank, IMF, and the EU mobilized very quickly. So decision was taken in several months to put additional support, additional budget support for the national budget of Moldova to close the budget deficit, first of all. But we somehow reached the borrowing level. So that's why we are requesting now or need now grant support. So, and first of all, budget support, which could be absorbed quickly, and there is no room to wait for project development for for years to wait things happen. So this is one channel, budget support. The second channel is to readjust existing projects. So we have, as I said, the energy crisis. So our primary priority is energy efficiency. So we are looking forward to adapt all existing projects or coming portfolios to Moldova to energy efficiency, then economy resilience. As I said, we have economic crisis due to all this other crisis. Then social cohesion, and the most important, or not as equally important thing, is to reduce the threats of hybrid war, which is there in Moldova, which if we will lack financing, so we risk to jeopardize economic development, to split the society, because we have this political fragmentation, which we have a part of pro-Russian political parties and citizens as well. So we are looking forward to mobilize all the resources quickly and to ensure that there is social cohesion in society, and we are moving. Nevertheless, the crisis, the refugee crisis, the energy crisis, we are looking forward to implement the reforms to develop the Moldovan society.
Very complicated moving parts, but in the end you can see how they all work together and how it matters to get them all working together. Let's get back to Rauf now. Food insecurity. This is a major concern around the world due to the war in Ukraine, clearly. I mean, we had it, but this has ramped it up in so much. What are you doing to relieve hunger and to create ways for refugees at the same time to make a living? It's kind of a two-part question. You got to be able to eat, you got to be able to get the food, but even then, if you're a refugee, you need to have a livelihood.
Yes, no, indeed, and it's important to also underline that the countries that are most exposed to the crisis in Ukraine, or to the impact of the crisis in Ukraine, are low and middle income countries in Central Asia, Eastern Europe, Middle East, and West Africa, as well as Sub-Saharan Africa, which together host more than 85% of the world's refugees. Many refugee population are also dependent on direct humanitarian food assistance. About 10 million of refugees are receiving food assistance from our colleagues from WFP to meet their food needs. And it's clear that the increase in food cost is going to also have an impact on the availability of this food for people who really truly need food assistance. We will continue to advocate for humanitarian assistance for this population. As you say, the best way to mitigate the impact in the long run is to try and reduce dependency. And for that, we need government possible to allow refugees to contribute their productive capacity to the economy of the country. There are many places where refugees could actually farm and could contribute to the economy of the country where they are. For that, they need support. There are a number of programs that we have with the World Bank, with the World Food Program to try and make sure that we work with governments and make sure that we try to reduce the dependency on external food assistance that refugees have. So the potential is there. We are even doing very innovative things with the World Bank, insect and hydroponic farming, for instance. I mean, these are things that we are pushing for now. And then lastly, and there was a number of references made to the private sector. We are initiating a very innovating and promising, I would say, partnership with the IFC to help structure and better harness the role that the private sector can play in the search for solution to forced displacement. And this collaboration will also help support agricultural production around the world in refugee setting and other places.
A lot going on there. Alejandro, I want to go to you now because a big question is a very simple one. How about helping the most vulnerable people, women with children, kids?
Absolutely. I think that is the key focus. And as Raouf was saying, the focus on the humanitarian in the long term and in the medium, very closely the medium term, is on the social economic inclusion. So in that sense, in terms of numbers of the temporary protection status, we have almost 100% of the Venezuelan population that is right now in Colombia has applied for the temporary protection status, and we've given around 700,000 already physically. But when they apply, what's great is that they have to fill up a questionnaire. And that questionnaire serves to understand who they are. Because half of them were undocumented. So who they are, what education level do they have, what skills do they have, where do they think we're going? And that information is fundamental to be able to target the most vulnerable population. So in that sense, for example, one of the biggest issues that we've had is the fiscal weight that this has meant on the health system. Because they're coming in very dire conditions directly to the emergency system when they're not regulated. And in the emergency system versus being part of the health system, it costs 2.5 times more to help someone. So to making sure with the temporary protection status that they are in the health system, and that way it's less expensive for the country to be able to help them. It has been, I think, one of the key success factors when it comes to the health program. Also working with the local governments to see what are the hospitals that are attending the biggest number of migrants and refugees, on one sense. On the other sense, as I was saying, about 55% of the population that is coming in is under 24. So to have a differentiated approach for education and for young children is fundamental. In that sense, for example, as the director of UNICEF was saying, the desertion rate is much higher in the migrant population than in the general population because they're traveling itinerantly until they know where they're going to stay. So having a very focused approach on these migrant children in particular to make sure that they go to school, that their track continues is fundamental. And finally, I think one of the great success factors that we've had in Colombia is skill set programs and certification programs to make sure that very quickly they become productive, that they get a job and are able to support their families and so on and so forth. So in that sense, certification programs of the skill set. So if you work in construction, to know that you know these skills in construction, or you work in engineering, you know these skills in engineering, that's very important to send a message. It's like an invitation letter that I know what I'm doing and I can get a job, which I think has been a very differentiated approach, which is key. To give you an example, we did a pilot program on certification a few months ago with 3,000 Colombians and Venezuelans who applied for this program. Of the 3,000, 1,000 were Venezuelans. So almost a third were in need to have that certification to be able to get a job with a skill set that has been certified.
Well, it's been a great discussion. The three of you bringing together the immediate problems, how you're dealing with them right now, the big picture, from the UN, and there's a very specific program. Fascinating. I think this has been very illuminating, and we appreciate it so much. It's clear that all these things have long-term benefits for helping displaced and their host communities. Now, we want to turn to another part of the world. In the West Bank, amid persistent and unpredictable power cuts, think of how that disrupts your daily life. A local company is investing in solar power to light up classrooms and futures. Let's hear from a student now.
أنا اسمي عبد الله ياسر أحمد سليمان. كانت الكهرباء تقطع عنا في أيام الشتوية طول اليوم تبقى قاطعة، إنه بعمل المعلمة ما بتقدرش تكمل حصتها بلا ضوء، يعني فيش بروجيكتور اللي تعرض لنا أشياء اللي نتفهمها تدفع اللي نقدر نتدفى، والصوف عندنا كثير واسعة، فالهواء بيبقى فيها كوي ونبقى يعني سكعانين، الواحد بيقدرش يتدفى. الوضع صار أحسن لأنه بطلت الكهرباء تقطع عنا، فصرنا عاد نكمل الحصة عادية ما فيش ولا أي مشاكل. بنشكر هذا بنشكر يعني دارسة متعلمة راح يساهموا انه يفتحوا شركة، يفتحوا شيء يساهم في تطوير البلد. إذا الشمس إن شاء الله راح تضل طالعة راح يكمل الكهرباء راح يكون أحسن.
I'm Jildis Jarkipova in Bishkek, Kyrgyz Republic, and you're watching the World Bank Group IMF Spring Meetings.
Well, we just saw a very impressive example in the West Bank how innovative private sector investments can make a big difference in people's everyday lives. Let's find out more about how the private sector can play an essential role, even in situations where there is ongoing conflict or a lack of strong institutions. Maktar Diop is the managing director of the International Finance Corporation. That's a member of the World Bank Group, and it's the largest global development institution focused on the private sector in emerging markets. He's going to lead our next discussion.
Thank you, Kathleen. We have been hearing about the multiple crises that countries across the globe are facing: war, conflicts, climate change, forced displacement, and the lasting impact of this COVID-19 pandemic. We have also heard that these compounding crises require collective response and innovative partnership. I must say that in my entire career, I've never seen a period like this with so many shocks and so many different types of shocks, and the magnitude and the size of these shocks. So we are faced with a multi-phase challenge and in a very unpredictable geopolitical environment. At the same time, more than ever, we know that the private sector can play a role in promoting peace and prosperity. The situation demands, obviously, bold action to venture the world in the world's difficult places. We need to be persuasive enough to convince our private sector partner to invest in fragile countries, but also we need to think differently about how this context. So I'm today delighted to welcome Donald Kaberuka and Mary Nazal, two champions of impact investing. With them, we will explore how the private sector can be a force for good in even the more challenging circumstances. Donald Kaberuka is very known in the world. He is a current chairman and managing partner of Southbridge and the African Union High Representative on financing the Peace Fund and COVID-19 crisis. But also he's been, for 10 years, the president of the African Development Bank, and before that, Minister for Finance in Rwanda. So a very large experience in development policy. Mary is a founder of Landmark Hotels and 17 Venture, an impact investment and advisory firm focused on advancing the UN Sustainable Development Goals. She was, in 2019, considered the best businesswoman in the region, and she has received many awards for a fantastic job. Donald, let's start with you. I know you are passionate about what you have been doing on fragility. So tell me, what role can the private sector play in the absence of a functioning government and in a period of active conflict?
Maktar, thank you very much for inviting me. Happy to be here with my colleague. Let me first of all say that when I was president of the African Development Bank, one of the first things I did was to create a department a fully-fledged department to deal with the fragility in some parts of Africa, because they found that we are not good at doing it. International organizations were used to rewarding good performance. Indeed, the way we allocate resources is known as performance-based allocation, which means that those countries who are mired in conflict were not getting the resources they needed actually to get things done. And so I created that department. And second, I recognize that when we say situation fragility, we basically mean that there's no effective state to deliver services, okay, to perform its regular function. I'll give you an example. This is a place where states don't have enough money to provide for security, or sometimes they, because of insecurity themselves, they don't control all parts of the country. And often, the fiscal base is so narrow, citizens have to self-provide, say, on infrastructure. If you take case of Somalia, Africa's first failed state, which was a failed state for almost 40 years, it is a business community which actually kept the country together in some ways. If you go to a place like Hargeisa, or even Biso Mogadishu, what was providing hospitals, schools, infrastructure, digital facility was business people, supported by banks like Dahabshil, which had found a way of making transfers from Somalis abroad quite effective. So yeah, business can actually function reasonably well, even when the state is not able to pursue its function. But this is what it means. Makta, number one, business does not have to mean big business. Because often when you say private sector, when you say business, people immediately think of the large beasts of this world, Microsoft, and the lack of them. No, it means from the smallest company delivering digital payments, from the smallest company delivering goods and services, and a lot of jobs in IDP camps. I recently chaired a panel with the former Prime Minister of the UK, David Cameron, on internally displaced persons, 70 million of them worldwide. And one of the things we're looking at, what is the role of business? What is opportunity for business? And we found that far too often, actually, these small businesses, what we call the informal sector, unfortunately, are actually the ones able to provide the daily jobs which people need, all right? And the absence of government, curiously enough, actually often removed the burden, especially regulatory burden, on some of them. Now, I'm not saying that that is necessarily a good thing, because you need a business environment which is regulated, which can settle disputes, and a lot of it. But the experience I've seen in Somalia basically is that actually people have managed to set up informal rules and regulations, informal dispute resolution mechanisms, and business has been booming, including some large companies like Coca-Cola and so on, under franchise. So it is not easy. It does not mean big business always. It means there's a government which does not control all parts of the country, or doesn't have enough fiscal resources to provide for goods and services, and people have to self-provide. But what is there in plenty are the skills and acumen of these businessmen and women. And so issue number one for us, Magda, is to identify those kind of men and women who have the skills and acumen to operate in difficult environments where governments are failing or have failed. Far too often, we focus on only the large companies. The second thing, the World Bank, long time ago, Magda, set up something which I find completely exemplary. It worked with governments of some African countries. I was the government of Rwanda at the time, and we agreed to part with a bit of our aid allocation money to seed an organization called the ATI, Africa Trade Insurance Agency, which basically picked up the risks in countries where there was civil or coming out of civil, where business, both production and trading, was difficult. Unfortunately, this example is not brought to scale, But I really hope that we learn from the ATI. I agreed as Minister of Finance to part with part of our aid allocation to seed the ATI. And I can tell you ATI has been exemplary. I just wish it had been brought to scale because it has the capacity to pick up some of those risks which some business people are not willing to take up. Over to you, Maktan.
Thank you so much, Donald. You bring me to a time when I visited IQ Somalia, and it was amazing to see how the private sector was brilliant and was creative. Mary, you might think that the situation is very different in the Palestinian territories, but there are a lot of similarities with what have been said by Donald in some part of Africa. So if I look at your experience, you've been someone who's extraordinary, moving from Jordan to bringing your business to the Ban and Gaza. Tell me a little bit, what is the success of your model? What do you measure success in general?
Well, thank you for the question, and thank you for having me. I think the importance of the private sector in all kinds of states is extremely important. So my work, or the model of our work, has always been at the nexus of business, social justice, and human rights. And our family business, which is Landmark, has operated with the community needs always being at the forefront. And I think with our platforms, our employee base, our client base, it shows that medium-sized companies have a huge platform to help push towards change for good. So the model that we have, our core value, is that you can do well and do good at the same time. So we have adopted several causes, whether they are poverty, displacement, gender equality, sustainable agriculture, as part of our business. And we have also partnered with organizations such as Endeavor to create an innovation impact hub within our hotel. So this shows, because the private sector is so agile, it can take on causes beyond their core business. And I think looking at the multiple crises that we are facing as humanity, even pre-pandemic, it shows that the public sector and private sector and civil society need to work together within the spirit of SDG 17. And 17 is the guiding principle of my company, 17 Ventures. I think the previous speaker made an excellent point regarding the size of the company that can make an impact. And as he brought that point up, I'd like to state that I am speaking to you today from a very small but aspiring company called Kama. This is a social enterprise that is empowering women all over Jordan to create artisanal products for export. And it's an example of how a small company can create jobs for women who need it the most. And there is another company that I'd like to highlight that I've been supporting for the past 10 years called CEP Jordan. And this is Jordan's first B Corp. And they are creating jobs in the poorest refugee camp in Jordan, the most marginalized. You mentioned Gaza in your introduction. These women come from the Gaza refugee camp, but it is a social enterprise. It is a business that has the empowerment of women as their key goal. So the point is that no matter what your business is, whether it's making za'atar, which is a local herb, or whether it's embroidery on scarves like CEP Jordan, you can always incorporate social justice work or human rights work within your business. And I think now we realize that all of us, including the private sector at the helm, need to be working on these issues with urgency.
Mary, you made a very powerful point. Actually, it was a conversation that I had with the head of UNHCR, and a place that Donald knows very well in the north of Kenya, at the border of Somalia, where we try to work with UNHCR to develop economic activity within the camp, because it is a whole economy which is existing in those camps. But both of you made very strong points, is that let's not look at only large companies. Small company matters, and that's the one who are starting and will be creating those markets. But what needs to be done to attract them, to de-risk them, because there are companies which don't have a lot of financial resources, which are entering a difficult environment. What can we do more to support you and to support from a policy stand what they are doing? Donald mentioned ATI, which was an experience, but what else? We are talking more and more about blended finance. What do you think about it? Donald.
First of all, what these people need is what you and I could easily understand. They need security. Security for themselves and security for their people and their workers. And so the first thing we have to worry about is that often these people are operating in areas of very high insecurity. All right? Now, there's nothing you can do about it or the World Bank can do about it. But so this happened in Somalia. They have created their own forms of community security. So that is a big problem which you and I cannot resolve. The second point I failed to make at the beginning, Makta, is that curiously enough, large companies, when it comes to the extractive industry, they find a way around it. But this for the specific reasons of rent which is available there, especially at the time. But they need most is someone to pick up some of the risks they face. I said to pick up some of the risks they face. And it can't be all the risks that will be shared. I think the World Bank in the past has been very instrumental in experimenting with some of those risk mitigating instruments for some of these small businesses. I'm talking about things like partial guarantees, first loss, which you and I know very well, Makta. We need to figure out how they can operate at all levels, not simply for big businesses. In particular, first loss has been very effective. Partial guarantee is very effective. And the way we have applied so far, it begins at fairly companies of size. I think we should bring them down to the kind of companies our colleague is mentioning. That'd be helpful. The second is what I can call fluid forms of finance, and which I'll describe this way. If we could agree to use a bit of IDA, just a bit of IDA, I think as you're trying to do now, all right? To provide some of that first loss, for example, right? That would be hugely important for the countries. Maybe more than just passing it on as a closed envelope. So I want you to figure out how this can be done. The third thing they will need is data, information. Because I told you, in these countries, maybe security is short infrastructure, but business people with the skills and knowledge is amazing. But they need data. They need data. And that you can easily provide. And very finally, I think we have to figure out how to work with the local financial institutions. What remains of those institutions? Look, take a bank like Dahabshil, right? First time the issue of money laundering or terrorist financing was becoming a threat, and banks were being, sanctioned. A lot of European banks stopped dealing with Dahabshil. You know this, all right? So all these transfers of Somalis living in Scandinavia or Canada was difficult to transfer to their country. I wrote personally a letter to some European leaders and a number of executives of the banks. I said, this is the wrong thing to do. Let us identify what? Who is the sender of the money? Who is the receiver of the money? Let us have that data, all right? Once we have that, then criminality in between can be minimized, all right? But let us not throw away the baby with the water, all right? So fluid finance, somebody take the loss, a bit of data, all right? And some imagination around traditional products like partial guarantees and first loss. My colleague here knows more than me on this, working from Jordan.
No, thank you very much, Donald. Mary, what is your take on this same question? What will make you invest more in and do more of what you're already doing?
We have worked from 2018 to design the first blended finance investment fund for Jordan. And we used the first loss facility. And the idea there, of course, was to de-risk real risk or perceived risk. I don't really know sometimes what it is. But the whole idea behind blending at the fund level was to try and drive new capital, private capital, to the region within which we work. I think it's early to tell, from my perspective, whether that level of blending and innovation at the fund level can actually have the effect of moving the capital we really need to move. It's not about having DFIs or donors come in at a fund like that. The whole point of having the first loss or sub-debt or whatever it is, guarantee facility, is to drive new capital. And I think we know that that is what we need to be doing. I think the other issue generally is a change of mindset within the investor mindset. So for example, Jordan and Palestine are perfect examples of where impact capital could be going. So our fund, the Jordan Growth and Impact Fund, which also looks at Palestine, has a clear SDG lens in the sense that we have an impact management and measurement framework to forward the SDG agenda. Also, for those who are interested in gender equality, we are seeking to invest in companies that increase female participation in the workforce. Additionally, we have a refugee lens in the sense that we are looking to invest in companies that hire refugees or run by refugees. We're also looking at companies that are inclusive when it comes to people with disabilities. So we have to identify and increase the amount of impact capital providers that are looking beyond the bottom line. But I think for all investors, countries need to have an investment climate where they find consistency, transparency, especially when it comes to tax regulations. There needs to be a healthy environment for all investors. And this is something that is exceedingly difficult in Palestine, given the dysfunctional political realities on the ground there. But even in a country like Jordan, which is very stable and has a thriving ecosystem, the investor climate is still something that needs work. And now Jordan has recently created a Ministry of Investment that I will be supporting to ensure that all investors feel secure when deploying their capital in Jordan.
Thank you very much, Donald and Mary, for joining us for this discussion. It was fantastic to hear so many interesting ideas, but a lot of experience. And you raise a large number of very important points, which will help us thinking again at the way we are working in fragile states. But luckily, there is a lot of convergence of views around what you said. You talked about financial institutions, you talked about size of companies investing in fragile countries, you talked about security, you talked about violence, you talked more importantly about blended finance. The need to bring more resources to help companies with their first losses, to be able to reduce the cost of capital, and to be able to have the social impact that we all want to have in those countries. So looking forward, we will be working towards increasing the size of blended finance to mobilize more resources from donor countries, but also in IDA to have a broader and larger PSW window, private sector window, to de-risk those investments that you talked about. And by de-risking them, not only will we be able to help the small and medium enterprises you mentioned, but also to be able to attract more capital. So that's what will be our agenda for the coming years, and we are looking forward to working with you. And thank you so very much for joining us and providing us so much insight. So talk to you next time. Bye.
I'm joined now by Sri Sridhar, who's been following the conversation online on social media. So Sri, I'm very curious to know what people have been saying, because we've had all these great examples of what's really going on the ground, how so many agencies, different people are trying to help. So I'm curious what the audience has picked up on.
Yeah, thank you, Kathleen, and great to be here with you today. So people are joining us from all over the world. A snapshot, they're here from India, France, the Philippines, Egypt, Kenya, Malaysia, and of course here the United States. And they're of course using the hashtag for today's event, which is Rising Fragility. And they're joining on our Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and also Instagram channels. But what are they talking about, Kathleen? They're talking about the need to invest in communities to address the causes of fragility and conflict, like poverty, injustice, inequality. But they're also noting that it's important to protect the most vulnerable and to also support refugees. So why don't we take a look now at some of the comments that have been coming in on our social channels. We have a comment here on LinkedIn from Priscilla in Brazil. And she says that countries should direct their resources to help vulnerable people and countries, and that in adverse and fragile times, there should be world cooperation and wisdom to address issues such as climate change and poverty.
Wisdom's very important.
Very much so. Our next comment here comes in on Facebook from Paul in Kenya. And he's saying that some of the conflicts occur in the most remote areas of countries. So to create a long-term solution and ensure sustainable peace, governments and development partners should open up these areas through infrastructure development. So, you know, hitting on a key area there
very
as
important
well.
everywhere.
And to wrap things up on Instagram, Deepika talks about women and children and says that support to fragile countries really starts by helping them first.
Yeah, we can see so much of that nowadays.
Yeah.
Speaking of women and children, speaking about questions, what are our poll results? There's some very tough decisions in there about, well, you set it up.
Yes, no, this is a great segue to our poll today. And we asked what should be the top priority for a country that's going through conflict and fragility. 6 options here. Is it social protection for the poor, addressing food insecurity, inclusion of vulnerable groups, survival of local businesses, peace talks and conflict resolution, or is it addressing domestic and interpersonal violence? I mean, these are all really such great options. It's hard to pick.
It is.
But what are you leaning towards?
Okay, I'm leaning towards food insecurity or social protection for the poor. So I think it's less odds. I'm going to go for food insecurity for the poor.
Okay, I am going to go for social protection for the poor, but shall we see how people voted?
Yes, do, please.
All right, and we had over 200 people take part in this poll. Results coming up here on the right, 23% believe the top priority is social protection for the poor, 22% addressing food insecurity, 11% inclusion of vulnerable groups, 7% survival of local businesses. Yeah.
Peace talks and conflict resolution,
yes. 28% is peace talks and conflict resolution, and finally at 9%, addressing domestic and interpersonal violence. So you know, most people here believe peace talks and conflict resolution is top priority.
It's hard not to say that any one of those isn't so vital.
Exactly.
Well, Shri, thank you so much for joining us. Great job with the social media and the poll. We really appreciate it.
Fofo, I'm Muslim Sidi Mohammed in Niamey, Niger, and you're watching the World Bank Group IMF Spring Meeting.
So I'm joined here now in the atrium of the World Bank Group by Sokeina Khan. She's Director of the Fragility, Conflict and Violence Group at the World Bank, and by Aisha Williams, who's the Director of Blended Finance and Corporate Strategy at the IFC. They're going to be answering some of the questions you've been posting in just a moment. But first, I want to recap the main points we've heard in the past hour, how we can help the most vulnerable. We heard that, for example, we live in a world of multidimensional risk. It's not just war, it's also pandemics, weak institutions, social tensions, food insecurity, inequality, climate change. They all impact human lives, especially the most vulnerable. Fragile and conflict-affected economies need investment and a vibrant private sector to create local jobs, generate economic growth and revenues, build infrastructure, support their families. Effective and accountable institutions are crucial in preventing and responding to conflict. We heard a lot of people from institutions talking about their efforts today. Forced displacement is a global crisis, yet if managed with inclusive policies, we heard a lot about that in Colombia, refugees can bring about social and economic prosperity to their host communities. Okay, so now got it all set up. Let's hear from Sokeina Khan and Aisha Williams. And Sokeina, I want to start with you. We have a question from Patrice Tacoma, and it is this: how does the World Bank manage or address social situations or tensions in conflict zones and in areas or countries that host refugees? That has got to be so very tough, particularly trying to get anything done in a conflict zone.
Thank you, Kathleen. First of all, it's critical for the bank to address the issues in social conflicts when you have tension by doing a lot of based on our toolkit. First, we need to do, Kathleen, is a good understanding of what is the source or what are the sources of the tension and what can we do to build resilience in those communities. the bank has invested a significant amount of resources in understanding the drivers of fragility, the root causes of fragilities, and more importantly, translating those drivers of fragility into development projects. That's the first thing we do. The second thing is, Kathleen, we heard today that the forcibly displaced people, the number has doubled during the past decade. We've seen that addressing the large flow of people within or from countries like Afghanistan, Yemen, Somalia, Syria, and now Ukraine, including as well, not to forget about the Sahel, is a key focus today of the bank's intervention. So our focus is on short-term, medium-term, and long-term. What we try to do is really to provide basic access to basic services, basic infrastructure, provide as well social protection, not only to the refugees, but including to the host communities. By doing that, we need partnership, strong partnership. We cannot do it alone. And we develop strategic partnership with humanitarian, including for the forced displacement population, work significantly with UNHCR. As a result, we've seen, and we've heard it from the Director of Planning earlier in Colombia, in countries like Colombia or Peru, that through multi-sectoral intervention and partnership, we were really able to address and support the forcibly displaced people and the host communities.
I agree. It's a tremendous example for others to learn from. And Aisha, now a question submitted by Amedi through the website for this event. It's submitted in Arabic. Got that global reach. That's what we wanted. Financial, that's what I would stress. Financial inclusion is a sensitive issue, requires urgent solutions. And it's so important, right? We think of inclusion in so many ways, but what do you suggest to encourage to get to financial inclusion? That's what so many people need.
First of all, thank you very much for not asking me the question in Arabic. That would have been an additional challenge. But clearly, financial inclusion is critical to development, and we believe in the World Bank that the private sector has a really important role to play in supporting financial inclusion. A few statistics: 9 out of 10 firms in emerging markets are medium, small, and micro-sized enterprises. And these firms contribute upwards of 50% to GDP and 60 to 70% to employment. So supporting these firms is critical to supporting development more broadly in these countries. How do we do that? Through a number of different ways. So at IFC, we work with SMEs through financial intermediaries. We provide loans to financial intermediaries for on-lending to SME clients. For example, in Haiti, IFC lends to Sogecel, which is one of the largest microfinance institutions in the country, which then supports women entrepreneurs, small farmers, and other such borrowers. Financial innovation is also a key element here. Initially, in the past, IFC has supported SMEs through, as I said, individual loans to banking intermediaries. To try and broaden our scope, IFC has recently launched the Small Loan Guarantee Program, whereby we provide guarantees to banks and to financial intermediaries to increase their loan portfolio to SMEs, thereby de-risking or removing some of the risks through our guaranteed product. So this has been quite important for us to expand our reach into the most segments of the population that need it most. Just one last thing, though. Financial resources are important, but technical expertise and technical assistance is equally important. You need to improve the capacity both of the SMEs and of the financial intermediaries in order to get the results that we all want. So through our advisory services, we provide that type of support coupled with our financial investments to help support financial inclusion.
So interesting, a lot of people in distressed, even poor areas, give them some money, give them some resources, and it's amazing what they can accomplish. Now, Sukaina, back to you for a question by a group called activist women. All right, you activist women. Why do women always fall prey to fragility in times of crisis, despite all the efforts and all the protest movements?
Kathleen, when we assume that women living in peace and stability are not vulnerable, what we realize is in crisis, the vulnerability of women is only a magnifier of what they live in peace and stability. That's the first thing that I want to share. The second is we think that women are a collateral damage of war. At times, it's unfortunately a deliberate and despicable tactic to target women. So we think that crises are gender neutral. They're not. A crisis like COVID will affect more women than boys. But if you look at schooling, for instance, you know that many girls will not go back to school even when schools will reopen. So that's why it's critical for our institution to be extremely deliberate. And that's what we're doing in our gender work. We do it through a full spectrum as well of our intervention. First, of analytical work. We try to better understand what is in a particular country the benefit of a more gender-inclusive society. Because on the bright side, Kathleen, we all know that when a society treats better its women, that society thrives. It's not only an issue of justice, social justice, it's a good economics to have a more gender equality, a more economic opportunities for women. So, and it's absolutely fundamental in our work, in particular in fragility, in fragile conflict-affected states, to put women at the center of our work, including because for peace and crisis prevention, women usually play a critical role.
Absolutely. I hope the activist women enjoyed that answer. I certainly did. I think you got right to the heart of it. Aisha, Tom, in Nigeria, there's a serious problem of insecurity in Nigeria that discourages foreign investors. This has got to be a problem around the world. His question is, what plan do you have to support the Nigerian government combat this situation?
Thanks. Another really excellent question. I mean, look, insecurity, instability is an anathema to foreign investment. Investors seek and crave stability in order to be able to deploy their funds. So trying to address that is a critical challenge that we face across the World Bank Group, but particular for IFC and for MIGA, which are the elements of the World Bank Group that focus on supporting private sector investment. We do this in a number of ways. First, it's important to recognize that there is a distinction sometimes between the perception of insecurity and actual insecurity. And it's quite important to figure out, to get to the root of that issue, to figure out what is the challenge that we're trying to address. MIGA, for example, the Multilateral Insurance Guarantee Association, provides insurance against non-commercial risks. So the perception of insecurity as well as actual insecurity. And it provides financiers with that essentially insurance against these non-commercial risks. So, for example, expropriation, the risk of expropriation of assets. IFC addresses the issue of insecurity through a number of ways, in particular through the use of de-risking instruments that we associate with our investments. So while IFC can provide a financial investment, a loan to a company in an emerging market in a crisis situation, additionally, we provide blended finance, or this is concession. We add concessional financing to our commercial financing to try and address certain specific non-commercial risks that may be associated with that particular investment. Again, these are various tools that we use to try and get to the root of those type of risks those type of insecurity risks that can really detract foreign investors from feeling comfortable investing in a country.
All right. Well, certainly there's a lot of tools And I'm sure there are many people in Nigeria who already know about this and are using them, but if they don't, you've helped spread the word today, and we appreciate it so much. Zukina Khan, Aisha Williams, thank you for taking the time answering these questions. Just a great way to top off a wonderful event today. I want to thank all of our guests for joining us, sharing in this important discussion. And I want to tell you about the great events still to come, including just an hour, so you can get up, walk around, you know, make your lunch, whatever. The event on trade and development, that's coming up. Tomorrow, the focus turns to human capital and the importance of investing in people. I think in a way we were just talking about this in our last discussion. You can also watch back all the events from earlier this week. Maybe you were at work, you were taking the kids to school, whatever. You can go back, you can see exactly what you want to see, including the discussion between the bank and IMF leaders on responding to global shocks, the session on the potential of the digital revolution for all you crypto folks out there, as well as a discussion around financing climate action. That's all at live.worldbank.org. And you can still share your comments on these spring meetings using the hashtag #ResilientFuture. I love that phrase. So happy to have joined us today. I want to thank this wonderful crew here. They have been fantastic. I want to thank the World Bank for inviting me to do this. It's been such a wonderful opportunity for me as a journalist to learn more, meet some wonderful people. I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you so much for watching. Goodbye for now.